The massive view screen aboard the Crixian flagship Eternal Logic displayed Earth in perfect clarity, a blue marble suspended in the void, seemingly insignificant against the backdrop of space. High Admiral Verax studied the planet with 6 crystalline eyes, each one processing different spectrums of light and data simultaneously. His exoskeleton shifted, producing a sound remarkably similar to human laughter. "Observe," he gestured to his war council, each member connected directly to the ship's tactical network through neural interfaces. They still use combustion engines for their aircraft. Their ground forces rely on chemical propellants. Their most advanced weapons are crude nuclear devices. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. And yet they dare to reject our offer of vassalage. The War Council chamber hummed with the subtle vibrations of quantum computers processing tactical simulations. The Crixian Empire had conquered 12 galaxies through perfect logic and technological superiority. Their warships could reshape planets, their soldiers wore armor that could withstand the heart of a star, and their tactical eye had never, not once in 10,000 years, failed to predict the outcome of a battle. In her apartment in Singapore, Sarah Chen watched the same sky the aliens observed from above, though through much simpler eyes. The former Marine Corps scout sniper sat cleaning her grandfather's old M24 rifle, a weapon that would seem absurdly primitive to the aliens above. News feeds worldwide showed the Crixian ultimatum on repeat: submit or face extinction. "They're making the same mistake every overconfident force makes," she muttered to herself, running a cloth along the rifle's barrel. 20 years in the Marines had taught her that victory often had little to do with technology. It was about the person behind the weapon, about understanding terrain, about patience, and about seeing patterns others missed. The Crixian invasion began exactly as their AI predicted. Massive ships appeared over major cities, their energy shields rendering Earth's missile defenses useless. Ground forces deployed in perfect geometric formations, their movements synchronized by quantum entanglement networks. Each soldier was a work of art, 3 meters tall, encased in adaptive armor that could respond to any threat in microseconds. Sarah watched from the shadows as they marched through Singapore's streets. While others saw invincible conquerors, she saw vulnerabilities. Their movements were too perfect, too predictable. They never looked up at the city's towering skyscrapers, never considered that primitive projectile weapons might penetrate their shields calibrated for energy weapons. Their eye had dismissed such possibilities as illogical. She wasn't alone in her observations. Around the world, veterans and fighters recognized the same patterns. The Crixians had forgotten the most basic lesson of warfare: never underestimate your enemy. They had become so reliant on their technology that they'd forgotten how to think like warriors. In the War Council chamber, Verax received the first reports of resistance. Primitive explosives detonated under patrol routes that AI had deemed optimal. Projectile weapons fired from impossible angles found gaps in shield harmonics calibrated for plasma weapons. The casualty numbers were insignificant, but the very fact that they existed defied all tactical projections. "Impossible," Verax muttered, his crystalline eyes flickering with confusion. The AI calculated a 99.99% chance of immediate submission once our technological superiority was demonstrated. He turned to his chief tactical officer. "Explain these anomalies." The tactical officer's neural interface buzzed as he accessed combat data. "The humans are not fighting according to any known military doctrine, High Admiral. They are using methods our tactical simulations classified as obsolete. The AI cannot predict their actions because they defy strategic logic." Sarah's first kill demonstrated this perfectly. A Crixian patrol walked the same route through the city center every day. Their AI had calculated it as the optimal path for maintaining order. From the 57th floor of an abandoned office building, Sarah waited. The shot, when it came, was almost too easy. A simple lead round, traveling at just the right angle, found a microscopic gap in the patrol leader's shield harmonics. The round itself would have bounced off their armor. But it carried something their sensors never thought to scan for: sand. The silicon particles, carried by the bullet, scattered across the shield gap. When the shield reset milliseconds later, the particles interfered with its calibration. The patrol leader's armor locked up, its systems crashing from what the Crixians would later classify as impossible primitive contamination. Within hours, resistance cells worldwide received detailed instructions on how to replicate the technique. The Crixians had expected Earth to fall in days. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight on their terms, an enemy that turned their own technological superiority into a weakness. As night fell over Singapore, Sarah packed up her rifle and moved to a new position. Tomorrow would bring more patrols, more perfect formations to disrupt. The Crixians would adapt eventually. They weren't stupid, just overconfident. But by then, humanity would have found new ways to fight back. That's what humans did best: adapt, improvise, and overcome. In orbit, Verax ordered a complete tactical reassessment. For the first time in Crixian history, the outcome of a conquest was uncertain. Their AI had encountered something it couldn't quantify: human unpredictability. The war for Earth was just beginning, and it would not be the simple subjugation they had imagined. The underground bunker beneath the ruins of Kuala Lumpur's financial district buzzed with activity. Sarah Chen stood before a diverse group of fighters, former Special Forces operators from a dozen nations, resistance fighters, and even a few civilian hunters. On the wall behind her, surveillance footage showed Crixian patrols moving through city streets with mechanical precision. "They're learning," Sarah explained, pointing to subtle changes in the aliens' formations. "But they're learning wrong." The footage showed Crixian soldiers now scanning upward, their weapons raised toward rooftops and high windows. "They've identified where we were, but not where we will be." Among her students was Marcus Torres, an ex-Brazilian jungle warfare instructor, and Aisha Patel, a former Indian Army sniper. They represented humanity's real strength, not just skill with weapons, but the ability to think creatively and adapt. Each brought different experiences, different ways of approaching problems that the Crixian eye couldn't predict. In orbit, the Crixian command was facing its own crisis. High Admiral Verax stood before a holographic display showing hundreds of failed engagements. Their casualties weren't high by conventional standards, but the very fact that primitives could harm them at all was unprecedented. "The humans have no unified command structure," his tactical officer reported, neural interfaces pulsing with frustration. "Each resistance cell operates independently, using different methods. Our AI cannot establish pattern recognition with sufficient accuracy for predictive strikes." Verax's crystalline eyes flickered in patterns that indicated deep concern. "Then we will force them to fight conventionally, deploy the city-scale shield generators, cut off their movement, their supply lines, force them into direct confrontation." Back in the bunker, Sarah's team watched as massive structures descended from Crixian ships, generating energy fields that divided cities into controlled sectors. The aliens' plan was obvious: trap the resistance in smaller areas, force them to fight on Crixian terms. "They still don't understand," Sarah said, a slight smile playing across her face. She turned to her team. "They think they're limiting our movement. What they're actually doing is giving us more corners to hide behind, more barriers to work with." The next phase of resistance began with something so simple it bypassed every Crixian security scan: mirrors. Resistance fighters placed small, ordinary mirrors at precise angles throughout the cities. The energy barriers, designed to stop physical movement and energy weapons, simply reflected off them. When Crixian patrols passed, the mirrors created split-second gaps in their personal shields. Their defense systems couldn't process the redirected energy fast enough. Marcus developed a technique using the city's drainage systems. The Crixians had mapped every street and building, but they ignored what was beneath their feet. His teams used the sewers and maintenance tunnels to move freely between the aliens' carefully controlled sectors. Sometimes, the oldest infrastructure proved the most valuable. Aisha contributed her own innovation. She noticed that the Crixian shields produced a distinctive harmonic when active, a frequency that interfered with certain natural materials. She began coating bullets with a mixture of local minerals that resonated at exactly the right frequency. When her shots hit their shields, the resonance created microscopic fluctuations that their systems couldn't compensate for. The Crixian tactical AI struggled to process these developments. Its fundamental programming was based on technological superiority and logical progression. The humans were using physics in ways that were technically correct, but had been dismissed as impractical by advanced civilizations millennia ago. They weren't just thinking outside the box. They were using the box itself as a weapon. In a bold move, Sarah's team orchestrated their first major offensive. They didn't target the Crixian soldiers or their weapons. Instead, they targeted their sensors. Using thousands of small mirrors and precisely timed movements, they created a cascade of reflections that overwhelmed the aliens' enhanced visual processing. In the confusion, resistance fighters slipped through their perfect formations, planting simple mechanical devices that would later disrupt their shield generators. Verax received the reports with increasing agitation. His neural interfaces were flooding him with data that made no logical sense. Humans were using primitive tools in ways that violated basic military doctrine. They turned the Crixians' own energy barriers into weapons, used simple optics to confuse advanced sensors, and exploited basic physics in ways that the tactical AI had deemed irrelevant. They're not just adapting, he realized, watching another patrol fall to seemingly primitive tactics. They're forcing us to adapt to them. The very idea was alien to Crixian military philosophy. They had always forced others to adapt to their superior technology and tactics. Sarah understood what the aliens couldn't. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or even their determination. It was their creativity, their ability to look at a problem from countless angles and find solutions that defied conventional logic. Every human brought their own perspective, their own way of thinking, and together they created a chaos that no eye could predict. As the resistance movement grew, the Crixians found themselves in an unprecedented position. Their technology was superior in every way. Their tactics were perfect by any logical standard, and yet they were losing ground. They had encountered something their vast empire had never truly faced before. An enemy that turned their own strengths against them, that refused to fight according to the established rules of warfare. The war for Earth was becoming a lesson in humility for the Crixian Empire, and a testament to humanity's most powerful trait, the ability to find strength in their perceived weaknesses. The Crixian Empire's most advanced tactical AI was experiencing something entirely new: confusion. In the vast data center aboard the flagship Eternal Logic, quantum processors struggled to reconcile mounting contradictions. Their perfect system, tested across 12 galaxies, was failing. Supreme Commander Verax stood amid a storm of holographic battle reports, his crystalline eyes cycling through spectrum after spectrum, searching for patterns that no longer existed. "Show me the latest simulation failures," he commanded, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty that would have been unthinkable months ago. The AI's response manifested in a cascade of incidents. In Mumbai, resistance fighters had used basic radio waves to create interference patterns in Crixian shield harmonics. In Rio de Janeiro, primitive rope and pulley systems had outmaneuvered advanced gravity manipulators. In Cairo, ancient tunnel networks that didn't appear on any modern scan had allowed humans to strike from impossible positions. But it was the incident in Singapore that truly demonstrated how far the situation had deteriorated. Sarah Chen's latest operation had turned the Crixians' own tactical doctrine against them in ways that defied their understanding of warfare. She stood in the pre-dawn darkness with her team, watching as Crixian dropships descended toward their landing zones with perfect mathematical precision. The aliens' AI had calculated these positions as optimal, accounting for every variable in its vast database. What it hadn't accounted for was the humans had learned to predict its predictions. They'll land exactly where we expect, Sarah explained to her team, because their AI can't conceive of choosing a suboptimal position. She nodded to Marcus Torres, who had rigged the surrounding area with devices that seemed primitive to their alien adversaries. The first dropship landed exactly on its designated spot. Its sensors detected no threats, no energy weapons, no advanced technology, nothing that registered as a military threat in its database. What it didn't recognize was the simple physics principle about to be demonstrated. Marcus triggered his device, not a weapon, but a system of water pipes scavenged from the city's infrastructure. Thousands of gallons of water, released at precisely the right moment, turned the landing zone into a frictionless surface. The massive dropship, designed to resist energy weapons and gravitational attacks, simply slid sideways, its perfect landing calculations rendered useless by basic mechanics. The AI's response time, measured in microseconds, meant nothing when its fundamental assumptions were wrong. As the dropship slid, its shield harmonics shifted to compensate, creating exactly the opening Sarah's snipers had been waiting for. Their shots found gaps that shouldn't have existed, carrying specially treated particles that played havoc with the ship's sensor systems. Aboard the Eternal Logic, Verax watched as the tactical display became a chaos of failed predictions and error messages. "How?" he demanded. "How are they doing this?" His tactical officers' neural interfaces pulsed with strain. "Supreme Commander, the humans, they're not trying to match our technology. They're using principles so basic our systems categorize them as non-threats. The AI, it can't predict their actions because it's programmed to expect technological escalation, not simplification." In different cities across Earth, similar scenes played out. Aisha Patel's team in Delhi used mirrors and prisms to redirect the Crixians' own sensor beams, creating ghost images that drew their forces into prepared kill zones. The aliens' advanced targeting systems, designed to track high-speed energy weapons, struggled to compensate for simple ballistic trajectories and ricochets. The Resistance had learned that the more primitive the tactic, the harder it was for the Crixian eye to counter it. They used sound waves to disrupt shield frequencies, basic chemical reactions to create sensor-blocking smoke, and mechanical triggers that the aliens' technology didn't even recognize as technology. Sarah's voice crackled over the Resistance network. "Remember, they expect us to fight tomorrow's war. Our advantage is that we know how to fight yesterday's." The Crixian command structure, for the first time in its history, faced a crisis of doctrine. Their AI, the cornerstone of their military superiority, was being undermined not by superior technology, but by its own complexity. It had become so focused on advanced warfare that it had forgotten the fundamentals. Verax ordered a complete tactical withdrawal from 3 major cities, a decision that sent shockwaves through the Crixian fleet. Their empire had never retreated from primitives before, but as he watched another perfectly planned operation fall apart in the face of human ingenuity, he realized they weren't fighting primitives. They were fighting an enemy that had turned their own assumptions into a weapon. In the bunker beneath Singapore, Sarah studied the Crixian withdrawal. "They're learning," she told her team. "But they're learning too late. They built their entire military on predicting the future, while we built ours on remembering the past." The tactical AI's predictions now came with probability ranges so wide they were tactically useless. Human resistance fighters had introduced too many variables, too many illogical approaches that nonetheless proved effective. The perfect machine logic that had conquered 12 galaxies was being undone by beings it had dismissed as primitive. As Earth's resistance continued to adapt and evolve, the Crixian Empire faced an uncomfortable truth. They had built their military doctrine on the assumption that advancement meant complexity. Humanity was teaching them, through defeat after defeat, that true advancement sometimes meant knowing when to embrace simplicity. The command deck of the Eternal Logic had become a tomb of shattered certainties. Holographic displays flickered with an endless stream of tactical failures, each one a crack in the foundation of Crixian military doctrine. Supreme Commander Verax stood motionless, his crystalline eyes dim with the first emotion his species had felt in millennia: doubt. The latest projections, Supreme Commander. His tactical officer's voice carried a tremor that would have been unthinkable months ago. Our AI can no longer provide reliable battle predictions. Human tactics have introduced too many mathematical uncertainties. We are fighting blind. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. The Crixian Empire, which had subjugated entire galaxies through perfect tactical prediction, was being undone by an enemy that refused to follow any predictable pattern. Below, in the ruins of what had once been downtown Singapore, Sarah Chen was teaching her expanded team of resistance fighters a lesson that would have bewildered the Crixians above. Technology isn't about how advanced your tools are, she explained, helping the young fighter adjust the sight on a crude but effective weapon. It's about understanding the principles behind them. Her network had grown. What had started as a small team of veterans had evolved into a global web of resistance cells, each adding their own innovations to humanity's arsenal of primitive solutions. They shared knowledge not through quantum networks or neural interfaces, but through whispered words and handwritten notes, methods so basic the Crixian sensors didn't even register them as communication. Marcus Torres had developed a new technique that exemplified their approach. Using nothing more than carefully timed sonic pulses, generated by modified musical instruments, his teams could create interference patterns that disrupted Crixian shield harmonics. The alien sensors, calibrated for advanced energy weapons, couldn't process the simple wave mechanics involved. Their weakness isn't their technology, Marcus explained to a group of resistance fighters. It's their inability to think beyond it. In Delhi, Aisha Patel's snipers had perfected what they called ghost shooting, using ancient principles of light reflection and refraction to make their shots appear to come from impossible angles. The Crixian targeting systems, designed to calculate complex energy weapon trajectories, were unable to track these seemingly simple ballistic paths. But it was Sarah's latest plan that would prove to be the turning point. She had noticed something about the Crixian command structure, a fatal flaw born of their absolute faith in technological superiority. Their entire chain of command relied on their tactical AI's ability to predict and counter any threat. They've forgotten how to think for themselves, she told her assembled team leaders via secure video link. Their soldiers can't make decisions without AI guidance, and their AI can't handle what we're about to do. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Resistance cells worldwide would launch simultaneous attacks, but not against Crixian military targets. Instead, they would target the one thing the aliens took for granted: predictability itself. In London, resistance fighters released thousands of small, mirrored drones, little more than toys with reflective surfaces. In Tokyo, they used ancient temple bells to create sonic patterns that played havoc with Crixian sensors. In New York, they flooded the subway tunnels with salt water, creating electromagnetic anomalies that their enemies' systems couldn't process. None of these actions were directly lethal. They didn't need to be. Their purpose was to create so much environmental chaos that the Crixian tactical AI would be forced to attempt multiple simultaneous predictions, each one making its calculations more unstable. Aboard the Eternal Logic, the effects were catastrophic. The AI's quantum processors, trying to account for thousands of illogical variables, began to generate contradictory tactical advice. Crixian ground forces, dependent on AI guidance, found themselves paralyzed by conflicting orders. Impossible, Verax whispered, watching as his perfect military machine began to tear itself apart from within. They're not even attacking us directly. They're attacking our ability to predict them. The command deck erupted in chaos as secondary systems began to fail. The AI, in its desperate attempt to process the flood of contradictory data, was consuming more quantum processing power than their systems could handle. Emergency protocols, designed eons ago and never tested, began to activate. Sarah watched from her command post as Crixian ships across the globe began to power down their tactical systems, switching to manual control. something they hadn't done in thousands of years. The aliens' greatest strength had become their greatest vulnerability. They thought technology would make them invincible, she told her team, watching as the mighty Crixian war machine stumbled like a giant with its eyes closed. They forgot that technology is just a tool. It's the mind that wields it that matters. As the sun set over Singapore, the Crixian Empire faced an unprecedented situation. Their tactical eye, the heart of their military doctrine, was effectively blind. Their ground forces, trained to rely on perfect tactical guidance, were forced to think for themselves, something they had never trained for. Verax, standing amid the ruins of his certainty, realized too late what humanity had understood all along. True military strength lay not in having the most advanced technology, but in understanding how to use whatever tools you had available. The stage was set for the final phase of Earth's resistance. The humans hadn't just survived the Crixian invasion. They had systematically dismantled the very foundations of their enemy's power. And they had done it not with advanced technology, but with the one weapon the Crixians had never learned to counter: the human ability to innovate, adapt, and overcome. The eternal logic hung in Earth's orbit like a wounded giant. Its quantum processors, once the pride of the Crixian Empire, sat silent. The vast artificial intelligence that had guided 12 galaxies to submission had been reduced to basic functions, overwhelmed by the chaos of human warfare. Supreme Commander Verax stood on his command deck, watching Earth rotate below, finally understanding what his species had forgotten millennia ago. "We became slaves to our own advancement," he murmured, his crystalline eyes dimmed to their lowest spectrum. "We'd forgot that technology should serve strategy, not replace it." The remnants of his invasion force were scattered across Earth's surface, their perfect formations broken, their tactical doctrine in shambles. Without AI guidance, the Crixian soldiers were forced to make decisions they had never been trained for. Some units had gone completely dark, unable to function without the constant stream of tactical data they had relied on for generations. Sarah Chen observed the aliens' disarray from her new command center, hidden within the depths of an abandoned mineshaft. The location was primitive by Crixian standards. No energy signatures, no advanced technology, just human ingenuity and the Earth itself. It was exactly the kind of place their sensors would overlook. "They're vulnerable," Marcus Torres reported, his face illuminated by the soft glow of basic LED lights. "Their ground forces are scattered, their communications are fragmented, and their ships are running on minimal power to prevent complete AI collapse." Aisha Patel added her own observations through a secure line from Delhi. "Their soldiers are starting to bunch up, seeking safety in numbers. They're showing fear, something their tactical doctrine never accounted for." Sarah nodded, spreading out a paper map. "Technology so basic the Crixians wouldn't even recognize it as a tactical tool. Then it's time for the final phase. We're not just going to defeat them, we're going to teach them something their empire has forgotten." The plan that followed was elegantly simple. Resistance cells worldwide would launch what appeared to be a massive coordinated assault on Crixian positions. The aliens, operating on manual control for the first time in their history, would respond according to their basic training, consolidating their forces, establishing defensive positions, preparing for a conventional battle. But this was merely a distraction. While the Crixians focused on defending against a traditional attack, Sarah's real strategy was already in motion. Teams of climbers, using nothing more sophisticated than ropes and harnesses, were scaling the massive energy transmission towers that powered the alien shield generators. Their movements were too slow and basic to trigger what remained of the Crixian detection systems. "Remember," Sarah's voice crackled over simple radio frequencies. "They're looking for advanced weapons, energy signatures, tactical formations. They're not looking for humans with simple tools and simpler solutions." The resistance struck at dawn. The apparent main assault began exactly as the Crixians expected, with human forces engaging their positions across multiple continents. Verax watched from orbit, directing his forces manually, believing he finally understood the human strategy. He was wrong. As the Crixian forces concentrated on the frontal assault, Sarah's climbers reached their positions. Using basic mechanical tools, wrenches, levers, and simple explosives, they began dismantling the very infrastructure that kept the alien invasion force functioning. No advanced hacking, no technological warfare, just the physical removal of key components. The effect cascaded through the Crixian force like a wave. Shield generators failed. Communication relays went dark. Supply lines collapsed. Their remaining AI systems, unable to process this kind of primitive sabotage, shut down completely rather than risk generating false tactical data. Impossible, Verax whispered, watching his invasion force crumble. They didn't defeat our technology. They simply went around it. In Singapore, Sarah led her team through the final stages of the operation. The Crixians, their tactical doctrine in ruins, their technology rendered useless by the simplest of human tools, began to retreat. Not in the ordered, strategic withdrawal their eye would have commanded, but in genuine, chaotic panic. The sight of Crixian soldiers, beings that had conquered 12 galaxies, being undone by humans wielding basic tools and fundamental principles was a lesson that would reshape their empire's understanding of warfare. Verax made his final decision not based on AI predictions or tactical analyses, but on a truth that had been buried beneath millennia of technological advancement. He opened a channel to Earth's remaining military leadership. "We surrender," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of an empire's humbled pride. "You have taught us what we have forgotten. True strength lies not in the advancement of our weapons, but in the wisdom to use what we have effectively." The terms of surrender were appropriately simple. The Crixian Empire would withdraw from Earth, but more importantly, they would fundamentally reevaluate their approach to warfare and civilization. They had learned that progress wasn't always about adding complexity. Sometimes it was about remembering the basics. Sarah stood on a rooftop in Singapore, watching the massive alien ships ascend into the dawn sky. Her old rifle rested across her shoulders, a symbol of the truth that had saved humanity. Sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective. "They came to teach us about advanced warfare," she told her assembled team. "Instead, we taught them about human ingenuity. And maybe that's the most advanced weapon of all, the ability to think beyond technology, to see solutions where others see primitiveness." As the last Crixian ship disappeared into the atmosphere, humanity had not just survived. They had fundamentally changed how one of the most powerful empires in the universe would approach warfare. They had proven that true advancement wasn't about abandoning the basics, but about understanding when to use them. The war was over, but its lesson would echo across the galaxies. Never underestimate a species that remembers its roots while reaching for the stars.